The 10,207th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Mr. Ramiz Al-Akbarov, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, United Nations Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, and Ms. Hanan Suleiman, Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Ramiz Al-Akbarov. The floor is yours.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, thank you for convening this important meeting on the situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Comes at a critical moment. While the fragile ceasefire in Gaza and regional tensions can consume much of the international community's attention, the West Bank is at the breaking point. And this has not been a sudden deterioration. It's the result of the decades of unresolved conflict that has deepened the unlawful Israeli occupation, driven the Palestinian Authority to the brink of collapse, and undermined the prospects for an independent, viable, and sovereign Palestinian state. In my briefing to this Council last month, I described the explosive dynamics unfolding in the West Bank. Today, I would like to highlight several developments that are deepening instability while moving us farther away from negotiated end to the conflict. I will begin with the sobering human toll. As of 10th of August, 76 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank in 2026, including 18 children by Israeli forces or settlers. In 2026, 3 Israelis, including 1 civilian and 2 members of the Israeli security forces, were killed in confrontations with Palestinians and in an alleged ramming by a Palestinian in the West Bank. 127 Palestinian communities have experienced full or partial displacement since January 2023, including 47 that have been entirely displaced, affecting more than 6,390 Palestinians. In 2026 alone, about 3,800 Palestinians, nearly half of them children, have been displaced due to settler violence, demolitions, and evictions. Settler violence has reached unprecedented levels. So far this year, the UN has documented more than 1,430 incidents involving Israeli settlers that resulted in casualties, property damage, or both, affecting approximately 260 Palestinian communities, and many incidents occurred in the presence of Israeli forces. Nablus Governorate has been particularly hard hit by recent violence. On 24th July, Israeli settlers attacked Tel village, triggering an escalation which left 4 Palestinians and 2 members of Israeli security forces killed. Hundreds of settlers then carried out multiple attacks, resulting in Palestinian injuries and extensive property damage. That same day, large groups of settlers attacked the village of Urif and Sara, also in southwest of Nablus, causing injuries and extensive damage to Palestinian property. Similar incidents are occurring on a daily basis across the West Bank. While accountability for such crimes remains rare, I note the 6 August indictment of an Israeli settler in connection with the July 2025 killing of Palestinian community activist Adwa Atalin in the South Hebron Hills. Last year, I visited Adwa's family as they were mourning his death, and I experienced firsthand the grief of this entire community. All perpetrators of such crimes must be brought to justice. Madam President, the pattern is clear. Palestinian populations are increasingly being forcibly displaced from villages across the West Bank before the settlers seize the vacated land. Settler attacks, which were previously concentrated in Area C, are increasingly reported in Area A and even in Area B and even in Area A. Israeli military operations and movement restrictions continue to disrupt civilian life and humanitarian operations, while refugee camps particularly affected. From 5 to 7 August, Israeli forces conducted a large operation in Kalang, the refugee camp, resulting in dozens of Palestinians injured, more than 60 people arrested or detained, and extensive property damage. On 27 July, Israeli forces and officials again entered the UNRWA Kalandia training center without authorization, while classes were in session. I reiterate that UN premises are inviolable and immune from any form of interference. Tensions also have increased in East Jerusalem. On 23 July, during Tish B'Av, large organized Israeli visits to Haram al-Sharif, including by an Israeli minister, again raised concerns over the preservation of the status quo at the holy sites. Madam President, alongside the mounting violence, Israel significantly accelerated settlement activities while consolidating its control across the occupied West Bank. Since the beginning of this year, Israeli planning authorities advanced or approved approximately 1,360 housing units in the occupied West Bank, including 7,200 housing units in Area C and 5,160 housing units in East Jerusalem. Significant resources are being allocated towards settlement expansion. On 14 July, the government announced some 431 million of US dollars to support the establishment of 34 new settlements approved earlier this year. The funding will finance infrastructure and prefabricated housing. Israeli authorities described this decision as strengthening Israel's hold on the West Bank and preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state. On the administrative task, implementation of reforms transferring planning, land management, and heritage responsibilities in the West Bank from the military administration to Israeli civilian authorities continued, further entrenching Israeli civil governance. The IDF also issued an unprecedented seizure order for privately owned land in Area A near Kabatia, south of Jenin city, to construct a road linking Noah and the Mengdotan, two of the 34 settlements recently approved. This marks the first seizure of Area A land explicitly for settlement infrastructure. These developments are taking place as the PA, Palestinian Authority fiscal crisis, remains acute. According to the PA, Israel is withholding some of $6 billion US dollars in clearance revenues, preventing the PA from paying full salaries and delivering basic services. Meanwhile, Palestinian financial stability faces a looming threat from the 1st September, when Israeli correspondent banks plan to end arrangements for processing shekel transactions. The extension of the indemnity waiver for the year end is welcome but insufficient. Sustained engagement between regulators is needed to secure a durable arrangement. The Palestinian Authorities reform efforts also must continue as outlined in Security Resolution 2803. Furthermore, I welcome ongoing preparations ahead of the planned 28 November Palestinian legislative elections, including steps to update voter registration and publish the electoral timetable. All stakeholders must facilitate credible, inclusive, and transparent arrangements, enabling all eligible Palestinians to exercise their electoral rights across the occupied Palestinian territory. Madam President, the situation in West Bank must be treated as an emergency required urgent action. The concern is not only the continued expansion of the settlements, but the speed and systematic manner in which new facts are being created on the ground. New outposts are established, often with state support, and can be retroactively authorized or incorporated into a wider settlement system. From these outposts, settler violence and intimidation have driven the displacement of Palestinian community. The spread of agricultural and grazing outposts is deeply troubling as well. Requiring only a small number of settlers, they enable control over vast areas of land. Israeli monitoring organization report that agricultural and pastoral outposts now exercise effective control over close to 20% of the West Bank. On 10 August, members of my team participated in a PA-led diplomatic visit to Bethlehem Governorate, where only some 7% of the land falls under Area A. They observed firsthand the impact of Israeli policies constricting Palestinian movement while enabling settler encroachment, including incursions at the historic site of Solomon's Pools in Area A. Madam President, we must be clear-eyed about what's taking place. These are interconnected steps, not isolated developments. They are reshaping the West Bank, weakening Palestinian governance, and advancing de facto annexation. The stakes are high. If the West Bank continues to unravel, it will not only undermine the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2803, which is the immediate focus of international community, but it will further erode the prospects for ending occupation and realizing a negotiated Israeli-Palestinian peace based on the two-state solution. We have the means to prevent further deterioration and advance a credible path forward. There is a broad consensus on the essential element of such path. Security Council Resolution 2803 must be implemented immediately and in full. The New York Declaration must be implemented together with the Resolution 2803 in a complementary and mutually reinforcing manner. Together and within the framework of the existing Council resolution, including Resolution 2334, they can provide the political vision and coordinated international effort needed to end unlawful occupation, advance the two-state solution, and resolve the conflict. We must act now collectively and determinedly to ensure concrete steps are taken towards that objective. UN remains committed to support all efforts in support of lasting peace between the Israelis and Palestinians based on 1967 borders, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states and both nations living in peace side by side. Thank you very much for your attention, Madam President. Thank you.
And I thank Mr. Alakbarov for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Hanan Suleiman.
Madam President, Excellencies, thank you to Denmark for convening this important briefing. We meet as the situation facing children across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continues to deteriorate. A grandmother told UNICEF colleagues that she was afraid to even step out of her home to put the rubbish outside because of nearly daily settler attacks. She described how an improvised incendiary grenade was thrown into her kitchen, setting the house on fire while her grandchildren were inside. She has since covered the windows with corrugated iron to try to protect her family. But the persistent sense of fear and insecurity haunts them, particularly for the safety of children while traveling to and from school. Imagine raising children under conditions like this, living behind metal-covered windows, afraid to step outside, afraid of what might happen to your children on the way to school, afraid of being exposed to violence in your home. For far too many Palestinian families, these fears have become part of daily life. Over the past 3 years, settler violence and increasingly militarized operations have escalated sharply across the West Bank. Children have been killed and injured, families have been displaced, homes, schools, and essential infrastructure have been attacked or destroyed. And the fundamental spaces of childhood, the home, the classroom, the street, the community, are becoming increasingly unsafe. Excellencies, the numbers tell us just how grave the situation has become. Between January 2024 and the end of July this year, 174 Palestinian children were verified killed by the UN in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. That is more than one child every week. More than 1,500 were injured. Nearly half of those injured were wounded by live ammunition. Over the same period, 3 Israeli children were killed and 15 injured. Boys, particularly adolescent boys, account for most of the children who have been killed and injured. The UN continues to monitor and verify grave violations against children in the West Bank. These include incidents in which children were shot when they did not pose an imminent threat. Some were shot while running away, while others were simply caught in the violence around them. At the same time, incidents of settler violence are increasing. These have resulted in grave violations against children, which have been identified by the Secretary General in his latest annual report on children in armed conflict. These incidents leave more than physical wounds. Children who survive serious injuries may live with disabilities for the rest of their lives. Some face arrest. Others struggle to return to school. Exposing a child to violence, raids, intimidation, and displacement takes a profound psychological toll. Parents tell us about children struggling to sleep, children who are afraid to leave home, children withdrawing from school and their communities. And parents tell us something equally devastating, that they no longer feel capable of keeping their children safe. That is a terrible reality for any parent, and it is a terrible reality for any child. Excellencies, the impact extends far beyond those children directly affected by the violence. According to the Education Cluster, more than 800,000 children in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, face barriers to safe and continuous education because of school closures, insecurity, movement restrictions, and damage to infrastructure. In 2026 alone, 99 education-related incidents were documented, including children being killed, injured, or detained in or on their way to schools, schools being demolished, school buildings being used by military forces, and children being denied access to education. Parents are struggling to keep their children learning when the journey to school itself can be dangerous. According to OCHA, across the West Bank, more than 900 additional movement barriers and restrictions have been imposed over the past 2.5 years. Many gates are frequently closed, which results in highly restricted access to movement and essential services, including access to health services and water sources. In a recent UNICEF mission to the West Bank, colleagues were told that settler attacks have damaged water infrastructure and equipment, including water network and storage tanks. This has resulted in reduced access to safe water and other basic water and sanitation and hygiene services. In some areas, developing new water sources is impeded, and as a result, residents now are forced to rely on expensive water trucking. Access restrictions are further compounded by repeated intimidation at checkpoints that deter or delay civilians from attempting a crossing. Excellencies, the situation of children in detention is also deeply concerning. According to the Israel Prison Service, at least 355 Palestinian children from the West Bank are currently held in Israeli military detention, the highest number in 8 years. Nearly half, 164 children, are held under administrative detention without charge or trial. Children in detention continue to report violence, ill treatment, humiliating and degrading treatment, and harsh conditions, with a pattern of inadequate nutrition and hygiene for children, resulting in extreme weight loss and rampant scabies infection amongst child detainees. This year, a UNICEF partner spoke to a boy who was arrested from his home in the middle of the night, faced physical violence, was hand-tied, blindfolded, and faced various violations. While being interrogated, the child was held in solitary confinement for over 20 days. Excellencies, the dire situation for children is being compounded by growing obstacles to humanitarian access and essential services. Local authorities have had tax revenues withheld and are unable to pay health and education workers, affecting children's access to basic services. Children requiring medical treatment must be able to reach it. Humanitarian workers and partners must be able to reach children safely wherever those children live. Despite those challenges, UNICEF and our partners remain on the ground. When families are forcibly displaced, UNICEF and partners provide emergency assistance, mental health and psychosocial services, cash, drinking water and hygiene, and support to continue their education. But humanitarian assistance can only mitigate the consequences. It cannot remove the causes. That requires political action. So today I leave this council with 4 urgent requests. First, protect children. Protect children. International humanitarian law and international human rights law must be strictly observed and followed. Law enforcement standards must be respected, with lethal force used only when strictly unavoidable to protect life. Specific safeguards must be put in place wherever children may be present. The administrative detention of children must end, and all practices concerning Palestinian children in the military justice system must be brought into line with international juvenile justice and child rights standards. We echo the call of the Secretary General in urging Israel to agree and implement an action plan with the United Nations to end and prevent grave violations against children. Second, end the forced displacement of Palestinian children and families. Member states must use their political and diplomatic influence to prevent further displacement and signal zero tolerance for violence against children, families, and communities. Third, protect children's access to education, healthcare, and other essential services. Children must be able to reach school safely, and children require medical treatment must be able to reach hospitals and health facilities. Lastly, protect humanitarian operations. Vital supplies must be allowed into and across the West Bank without unnecessary delay. Public services upon which children and families depend must be protected from interruption. And humanitarian organizations and their partners must be able to operate safely, independently, and without administrative measures that prevent them from reaching children in need. Excellencies, the humanitarian consequences of what is happening in the West Bank are profound. But behind every statistic is a child afraid to walk to school, a child recovering from a gunshot wound, a child held in detention, a child watching her family home being demolished, and a child sleeping behind corrugated iron because her grandmother is trying to keep fire from coming through the window again. These should not be the defining experiences of childhood. Children in the West Bank have the same rights as children everywhere, to live, to learn, to be protected, and to imagine a future beyond violence and fear. UNICEF will continue to advocate for the protection of all children and to provide humanitarian assistance and protection to every child we can reach. But humanitarian organizations cannot create the political conditions that children need to be safe. That responsibility rests with member states who have the power to change them. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. Suleiman for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
je veux remercier le coordinateur spécial adjoint, M. Ramiz Alakbarov,
Deputy Special
la
Coordinator
directrice
Mr.
exécutive
Ramiz
adjointe
Alakbarov
d'UNICEF,
and the Deputy
Mme Hanan Suleiman,
Executive
pour leurs
Director
interventions.
of UNICEF, Ms. Hanan
La
Suleiman. I
France a
thank them both
demandé,
for their
avec
briefings.
les autres
France,
membres
alongside
européens
the
du
other
Conseil, la
European
tenue
members of
d'une
the
réunion
Council,
sur la
called for the
situation en
convening of a
Cisjordanie
meeting on the situation in the
face aux
West Bank
violences
in
survenues
view of
ces
the
dernières
violence
semaines
that has
qui ont
occurred
fait
in
plusieurs
recent
victimes
weeks that has
israéliennes et
produced
palestiniennes.
several Israeli and Palestinian
Nous pouvons
victims.
ignorer
We
ce qui se passe en
cannot ignore
Cisjordanie.
what is happening in the West
Les
Bank.
violences qui y sont
The
commises
violence that is
s'inscrivent dans une
perpetrated
dynamique
there is
d'accélération
part
de la
of a broader
colonisation
dynamic
et de
whereby
multiplication de la
settlement
violence des
activity
colons
is
à l'égard
continuing
des civils
and settler
palestiniens.
violence against
Une telle
Palestinian civilians
situation
is on the
constitue une
rise.
menace
This
directe
situation
à
is
la
a
stabilité
direct threat
régionale
to
et à
regional
la
stability
viabilité
and to
de
the
la solution à deux
viability
États.
of the two-state
C'est au cœur
solution.
de la déclaration de New
That
York adoptée
solution
l'année
is at the
dernière
heart of the New
et que la
York
France
Declaration
soutient
adopted
sans
last
réserve.
year, a declaration which
Nous sommes
France
attachés à la
unreservedly
préservation de la
supports.
sécurité
We
d'Israël,
are committed
qui
to
est également
safeguarding
au
Israel's
cœur de notre
security,
diplomatie.
something that is also at the heart of our
Alors
diplomatic
qu'Israël a
efforts.
annoncé le lancement d'une opération militaire
Israel
d'ampleur, la France
announced
appelle
the
l'ensemble des
launch of a
parties au
large-scale
calme
military
et à la
operation.
retenue.
At this time,
Elle
France
rappelle
calls upon all parties to remain
l'obligation de
calm
l'armée
and
israélienne
exercise restraint. We
de
wish to
protéger
remind the Israeli
les
army of
populations
its
civiles.
obligation to protect
Madame la
civilians.
Présidente,
Madam President,
4 tendances se
four
combinent et
trends
marquent une
are
aggravation sur le terrain.
converging and indeed worsening
Premièrement,
on the ground, or
les
indicating that
violences
things
de
are
colons
worsening.
contre les populations
Firstly,
palestiniennes
settler violence
s'intensifient
against Palestinian
dans un
people
climat
is on the
d'impunité,
rise in a climate
et
of
cela
impunity.
sans réponse de la part
And that is
des
meeting
forces
with
armées
no
israéliennes.
response from the
Ces
Israeli
actes de
armed
terreur sont
forces.
inacceptables.
These acts of terror are
Nous condamnons
unacceptable.
le
We
ciblage
condemn
croissant
the
des
increasing
femmes et
targeting
des enfants
of
et
women
les
and
restrictions de
children
mouvement
and
et
the
d'accès aux soins
restrictions
imposées par les
placed
forces
on movement
israéliennes
and access to
qui sont
healthcare
contraires au
by
droit
the Israeli
international.
forces. These are all in breach of
Les attaques
international
terroristes
law.
visant des
Terrorist
civils
attacks
israéliens
targeting
doivent
Israeli
également
civilians
cesser.
must also cease.
Deuxièmement,
Secondly,
la colonisation israélienne
Israeli
s'accélère dans un
settlement
mépris total
activity
du droit
is picking up
international.
pace in absolute
Son
disregard
expansion
for
continue,
international law. Settlements
l'image du
continue to
projet
expand
E1,
as seen with the
la
E1
légalisation
project. We're
d'avant-postes,
also seeing the
les
legalization
confiscations de
of
terres
outposts,
et les démolitions
land
de
seizure,
structures
and the
palestiniennes
demolition of
contreviennent à
Palestinian
la
structures.
résolution
All of these
2334
run
de ce
counter
Conseil.
to
La France
Council
s'oppose
Resolution
fermement à la dynamique engagée par
2334.
Israël
We staunchly
d'une forme
oppose
d'annexion
Israel's
de facto
process of de
et de
facto
déplacement forcé.
annexation and forced
La
displacement.
France et ses partenaires de l'Union
France
européenne
and
ont
its
pris des
EU
sanctions
partners
contre
have
les
taken
entités et
out
individus
sanctions
responsables
against entities and
et
individuals
prendront des
responsible,
mesures
and we
supplémentaires,
will take
y compris
additional
des
measures,
sanctions et des mesures
including
commerciales,
sanctions
pour
and
y faire
trade
face.
measures to address the situation.
Troisièmement,
Thirdly,
Israël continue de
Israel
fragiliser
continues to
l'autorité
weaken the
palestinienne
Palestinian
en refusant de
Authority
lui
by
reverser ses
refusing
recettes
to
fiscales
return
et de
to the
renouveler
Authority its tax revenue and by refusing to renew correspondent banking services. These acts compromise the authority's ability to guarantee the Palestinian people with the necessary services and their ability to undertake necessary reforms. France welcomes the PA's announcement that it will hold legislative elections in November 2026 and presidential elections in 2027. We call upon all parties to guarantee the holding of elections which allow the Palestinian people to democratically express their will across the full extent of occupied territory. Attacks against UNRWA continue, as illustrated by repeated Israeli incursions into the Kalandia training center. These incursions are unacceptable. We call upon Israel to lift obstacles on the crucial work of UNRWA and to respect UN privileges and immunities. The situation in West Bank is inextricably linked from that in Gaza. Both are integral parts of Palestine. Instability in the West Bank compromises the progress allowed by the ceasefire in Gaza, as well as by the peace plan and resolution 2803. All of this imperils the two-state solution. France decries the Israeli Prime Minister's rejection of the agreement on Hamas disarmament. That is a long-held demand on our part and something that features in the New York Declaration that was adopted last year. France commends the efforts of the US, Egypt, Qatar and Turkey to achieve this essential goal, essential that is for regional security. We call once again upon all parties to accept this agreement. Hamas must lay down its weapons. It is also crucial that the Israeli army withdraw from the Gaza Strip, that the International Stabilization Force be deployed there to support the Palestinian forces and to prepare for the return of the Palestinian Authority at full strength. Finally, humanitarian aid must be able to enter immediately, completely and at scale into Gaza, as this Council called for when it adopted 2803 last year. President, 1 year after the adoption of the New York Declaration, which must indeed remain our roadmap for collective action, France will continue to support efforts for the two-state solution. That is the only viable solution for peace and lasting security for all in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me to begin by thanking our briefers, Deputy Special Coordinator Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov and UNICEF Deputy Executive Director Ms. Hannah Suleiman for their remarks. Greece, together with its fellow European members of the Security Council, called for today's meeting as we consider it essential for the Council to remain seized of the developments in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We meet at a critical moment amid ongoing efforts to consolidate the ceasefire in Gaza and advance its next phase. We must thus ensure that the prospects for peace are not eroded by developments on the ground in both Gaza and the West Bank, which constitute a single, indivisible territorial unit of a future Palestinian state. Madam President, the situation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem remains concerning. We are witnessing developments that threaten to fundamentally alter the realities on the ground: settlement expansion, repeated evacuation orders, demolitions and evictions, as well as forced displacement. Such actions run counter to international law and Security Council Resolution 2334, while continuously eroding the foundations upon which the two-state solution must be built. The rise in settler violence targeting Palestinian civilians, including Christian communities, is a source of grave concern and should be addressed promptly. Thorough investigations, prosecution of perpetrators, and effective follow-up remain essential. At the same time, Greece firmly condemns terrorism and all attacks against civilians. Israel has legitimate security concerns which must be addressed in accordance with international law. We call on all sides to exercise maximum restraint and to refrain from actions or rhetoric that could fuel further violence and escalation. We also reiterate the paramount importance of preserving and respecting the historic and legal status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem. Any actions that undermine this long-standing arrangement are deeply concerning and must be avoided. This principle is indispensable for interfaith coexistence and regional stability. The stabilization of the West Bank also requires addressing the severe humanitarian and economic pressures facing the Palestinian population. The continued withholding of Palestinian tax revenues is placing the Palestinian Authority under unsustainable financial strain. We reiterate our call for the immediate release of these revenues, which are essential for maintaining institutional stability, delivering basic services, and enabling the Palestinian Authority to pursue its reform agenda. We acknowledge the steps already undertaken by the Palestinian Authority towards reform under exceptionally difficult circumstances and encourage their continuation. A strengthened, reformed, and effective Palestinian Authority remains a credible partner for peace. We want to see the Palestinian Authority succeed in its reform agenda and return to Gaza as soon as conditions allow. Madam President, the international community must continue to ensure the safe, rapid, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance to all those in need. The role of UNRWA in providing essential humanitarian assistance, healthcare, education, and protection services to Palestine refugees in Gaza and the West Bank remains indispensable in this regard. Greece will continue supporting those efforts, including through the European Union PEGAS mechanism, channeling its funding to East Jerusalem hospitals. In conclusion, Madam President, the current moment calls for renewed political courage and diplomatic engagement. As reaffirmed by the New York Declaration and the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution, the international community remains committed to preserving a credible political horizon. For Greece, the path ahead can only be through a meaningful political process leading to a negotiated two-state solution, allowing Palestinians and Israelis to live side by side in peace, security, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Ramiz Alakbarov and Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Hanan Suleiman, for their informative briefings. Together with Denmark, France, Greece, and the United Kingdom, Latvia has called for today's meeting to underline that urgent steps are needed to address the deteriorating situation in the West Bank. At a time when attention is focused on the full implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Plan in Gaza, developments in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, remain a matter of growing concern and must not be overlooked or viewed in isolation from enduring international efforts to achieve stability and peace in the region. In the past 7 months, the trajectory has been alarming. More than 1,380 settler attacks have been documented by the UN, affecting over 250 Palestinian communities across the West Bank. This year alone, 77 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces or settlers. It is particularly appalling that 1 in 5 Palestinians killed in these violent incidents was a child. 3 Israelis, including 2 members of the Israeli forces, have been killed by Palestinians in the West Bank during the same period. This violent environment fuels mutual hatred and leads to increasing security risks, both for Palestinians and Israelis. The humanitarian situation in the West Bank continues to deteriorate, driven by forcible displacement, settlement expansion, settler violence, and growing access constraints. Displacement has reached unprecedented levels this year, with July recording the highest number of people displaced since April 25. Continued settlement expansion and the annexation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are not acceptable. We once again call on Israel to end its settlement policy and to ensure accountability for the attacks on and killings of civilians. International law and commitments, including Security Council Resolution 2334 as well as previous arrangements to which Israel has pledged itself, must be fully respected. The increasing acts of violence and vandalism by settlers directed against religious sites and places of worship in the West Bank further inflame tensions in already volatile environments. And we call on Israel to abide by the historic status quo arrangements governing the holy sites in Jerusalem and protect and ensure the safety of all religious communities. The extensive grid of checkpoints and roadblocks continue to make it difficult for Palestinians to access their workplaces and basic services, including schools and hospitals. Students have been affected by demolitions, military raids on educational institutions, and detention while traveling to school. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the most widely ratified human rights treaty, stipulates that every child has the right to education. Moreover, education is one of the strongest foundations for a lasting peace and reconciliation, to be fostered through a reformed curriculum that leaves no room for extremism. Access to healthcare is similarly affected, with patients, including children, in need of specialized or emergency care, facing delays in reaching medical facilities. Safe and sustained access to education and healthcare, protection of civilians, and facilitation of rapid, safe, and unimpeded access to essential services must be ensured. The measures contributing to the Palestinian Authority's fiscal crisis and undermining the Palestinian economy are deeply concerning. Israel must ensure that the Palestinian banking sector can operate unobstructed and that withheld tax revenues are released, enabling the Palestinian Authority to meet its budgetary obligations and provide essential services. At the same time, the Palestinian Authority must fulfill its commitments to pursue meaningful, comprehensive reforms. This must include strengthening governance and accountability, addressing radicalization, ensuring provisions of basic services, including education, in line with the UNESCO standards, and reforming the payment system for families of prisoners. Concrete steps must also be taken to prevent incitement, discourage violence, and promote peaceful coexistence. Progress on these commitments is an essential part of international support for the Palestinian Authority and its institutions, while awaiting holding fair and inclusive elections as announced. Madam President, for decades we have witnessed that military power, as well as armed resistance, fuels the recurring cycle of violence, reignited by proponents of extreme views on both sides. This trajectory does not constitute a path to sustainable peace. Addressing both the security concerns and the legitimate aspirations of Israelis and Palestinians requires renewed momentum. The full implementation of the comprehensive plan, as put forward by President Trump and endorsed by the Security Council in Resolution 2803, requires genuine engagement by all parties. A political perspective encompassing Gaza and the West Bank is the only way to achieve long-term stability. In line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and the New York Declaration, Latvia reaffirms its commitment to the two-state solution and to contributing to the shared objective of peace and stability in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement. And as I give the floor to the next speaker, I would like to warmly welcome to the Security Council Ambassador Sarah McIntosh, the new permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations. We look forward to closely engaging with you on the Council's work in the days ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. It's an honour to be here, and I look forward to working with all colleagues here and across the United Nations family. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Deputy Special Coordinator Alak Barov and Deputy Executive Director Suleiman for your briefings. The United Kingdom is clear that the only credible path to lasting peace and security remains a two-state solution, with a safe and secure Israel alongside a sovereign and viable Palestinian state made up of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. 3 priorities to advance progress towards that goal. First, in Gaza, the United Kingdom welcomes the recent focus on implementing Security Council Resolution 2803 and wants to see it implemented in full. That means all parties delivering on their commitments, including respect for the ceasefire, Hamas fulfilling its decommissioning commitments, the phased withdrawal of the Israeli Defense Forces as set out in the 20-point plan and the Roadmap Phase 2, and the transition of governance and security control to the Palestinian Authority. We encourage the Palestinian Authority to continue implementing reforms needed to fulfill that role. We thank the US, Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt for their tireless efforts to progress these negotiations. The United Kingdom will continue to work with all our partners to end the conflict in Gaza and the terror threat from Hamas. As Foreign Secretary Ed Miliband has said, conditions for the people of Gaza remain appalling. Israeli authorities must end unacceptable restrictions on aid and enable safe, sustained, and unhindered humanitarian access across Gaza. Second, addressing violence in the West Bank. The United Kingdom condemns escalating violence across the West Bank. In July alone, 13 Palestinians and 2 Israelis were killed. Recent attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinian villages and communities, in some cases alongside Israeli Defense Force personnel, are appalling. These are not isolated incidents. OCHA's July report records more than 1,300 settler-related incidents affecting over 250 Palestinian communities, around 900 Palestinians injured, and more than 3,200 displaced. And at least 3 Israelis have been killed and 24 injured this year. Children are among the most affected by this conflict. They are being exposed to repeated violence, displacement, and disruption due to movement restrictions and military operations. On the 4th of August, Israeli forces demolished 3 donor-funded classrooms at Shab al-Batoum school, just weeks before the start of the school year. We call on the government of Israel to fulfill their obligations to protect the Palestinian population of the occupied territory. We welcome recent arrests and indictments by Israeli authorities of the perpetrators of settler violence. But perpetrators have acted with impunity for too long, and much more must be done to prevent and prosecute acts of violence. Israeli authorities' security measures must be proportionate, consistent with international law, and contribute to de-escalation. Third, halting expansion of settlements in the West Bank. Settlements are illegal under international law. They undermine the viability of a two-state solution, and they fuel insecurity for both Palestinians and Israelis. The government of Israel has approved 104 settlements in 4 years, an increase of 80%, and allocated unprecedented funding to the construction of new settlements. The United Kingdom condemns threats to expand illegal settlements and outposts and opposes the decision to reintroduce the E1 settlement plan, which aims to cut the West Bank in half. We are alarmed by recent mass incursions at the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount. The status quo on Jerusalem's holy sites must be respected. Madam President, in the past weeks, we have seen renewed efforts to implement Resolution 2803, which offers the most viable pathway towards lasting peace. The deteriorating trajectory in the West Bank must not undermine that hard-won process. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Madam President, the DRC thanks the Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Mr. Ramiz Al-Akbarov, as well as the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Ms. Hanan Suleiman, for their insightful briefings. Barely a month ago, on June 29th, a delegation had already expressed its concern regarding the persisting violence and tensions in the West Bank. Developments since then, unfortunately, have only heightened this concern and highlight the urgent need to maintain conditions conducive to a lasting peace. The DRC believes that de-escalation and the prevention of new tensions must remain the absolute priority for the sake of all populations concerned, as well as regional stability. My country has strongly condemned all violence against Palestinian civilians as well as Israeli civilians and all acts of terrorism and call on all parties to demonstrate responsible restraint. My country has been attentively following the evolution of the situation as well as the growing difficulties that face civilian populations, especially in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Displacement, restrictions on access, and disruptions of essential services continue to affect the most vulnerable communities. My delegation is especially concerned by the situation of children who are the primary victims of this instability. In the West Bank, disruptions of access to education, healthcare, and essential services further jeopardize children and the most vulnerable families. The DRC underscores the importance of maintaining, whenever possible, the continuity of these services and to guarantee that every child is able to grow, learn, and to develop in conditions that are decent and that foster a bright future. Here, the DRC would like to reaffirm the importance of the full implementation of Resolution 2334 of 2016 of the Security Council, as well as the respect for obligations under international law. We encourage all parties involved to avoid measures and actions that could further inflame tensions, compromise stability on the ground, or hamper progress toward a negotiated and lasting solution. We are troubled by the humanitarian situation, and we therefore call for continued efforts to guarantee safe, rapid, predictable, and coordinated humanitarian access for populations in need. In this regard, we commend the actions of the UN as well as the humanitarian organizations that continue their mission under difficult circumstances. The DRC also encourages the strengthening of coordination between actors involved in order to facilitate aid delivery in line with legitimate security needs, protection of civilians, and international law. Special attention ought to be paid to protecting humanitarian workers as well as the continuity of essential services, especially in the areas of healthcare, education, water, and sanitation. Madam President, the government of my country is convinced that the response to the current challenges must be part of a broader political perspective. The international community ought to continue to support efforts to create conditions for a lasting peace that is based upon dialogue, respect for international law, and due regard for the legitimate concerns, security concerns of all parties. The DRC also recognizes the legitimate concerns with regard to security of Israel and underscores that these, as well as protection of civilians, ought to be taken into account while fully respecting international law. We therefore encourage all parties to exercise restraint, pursue dialogue, and abstain from any actions that could exacerbate the situation on the ground. Only a credible, negotiated political process that is based upon the relevant UN resolutions will bring about a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace that provides populations the security, dignity, and stability that they legitimately aspire to. Madam President, in closing, the DRC reaffirms its commitment to upholding international law, to protecting civilian populations, and to seeking a lasting political solution. We remain convinced that the path of dialogue, restraint, and cooperation ought to prevail over that of confrontation in order to maintain prospects for peace and stability in the region. The DRC calls upon the international community to continue its efforts steadily and with determination in order to pave the way for a lasting peace based upon coexistence, dignity, and security for all. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Liberia thanks the Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF for their qualified briefings. Excellencies, 79 years ago, Liberia cast its vote for UN Resolution 181, a vision of two sovereign homes, an Arab state and a Jewish state. One was born, and Liberia was among the first to recognize it. The other has spent nearly 8 decades caught in the cruel physics of occupation, displacement, and unfulfilled promise. Liberia has never withdrawn that vote. Today, this council treats the two-state solution like a permanent destination we describe in briefings rather than a political decision we actually enforce. We deplore, we adjoin. And meanwhile, physical facts on the ground are set in concrete. The latest UN reports lay bare a rapidly deteriorating reality across the West Bank. Over 33,000 Palestinians remain forcibly displaced from Jenin, Tokam, and North Shams, their homes emptied, their right of return denied. Acceleration of the E1 settlement project and ongoing land grabs threaten to sever the West Bank in two, dealing an irreversible blow to any viable contiguous Palestinian future. These are not administrative adjustments. They are the systematic burial of peace. Yet, Liberia's clarity remains absolute on two non-negotiable principles. First, security is indivisible. No durable peace can ever take root while Israelis live under the terror of attacks. We condemn such violence unequivocally. Concurrently, we condemn with equal severity the unbearable suffering inflicted upon Palestinian civilians, where women and children bear the catastrophic brunt of a crisis not of their making. Hamas, an armed faction that holds a population's statehood hostage to its own survival, paradoxically undermines the very liberation and much-needed statehood it claims to pursue. The full implementation of Resolution 2803 and the decommissioning of non-state weapons are essential to establishing one legitimate government, one law, and one accountable security authority. The same is and must be true about ending settlement expansion and its associated violence in the West Bank. Second, human dignity cannot be conditional. The Secretary General's reports record a staggering scale of violence and violations against children across the region. No child should ever become collateral damage to the political failures of adults. Madam President, Liberia asks this council to measure our credibility on this issue against 4 tests: protection, return, accountability, and viability. If we fail these 4 tests, let us then drop the diplomatic pretense. We are not preserving a 2-state solution. We are presiding over its slow motion disappearance. History will not ask whether this council issued enough press statements or debated the Middle East and Palestinian question time without number. It will ask whether, when the window for peace was being sealed shut beneath concrete and violence, we had the courage to act. Excellencies, Liberia cast its vote for 2 states in 1947. 79 years later, we continue to stand for the security of both peoples, the dignity of both peoples, and the absolute right of their children to inherit a future defined by peace, definitely not by perpetual war. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. The distinguished permanent representative of Liberia just reminded, and very rightly, this council of its responsibilities towards this situation that we are discussing. And the 2 briefings we have heard today are, in fact, calls for action. The situation as presented is grave. The figures quoted speak for themselves. Deputy Special Coordinator Ramiz Al-Akbarov provided the crux. These are not isolated developments. These are interconnected steps building on decades of conflict and occupation that are undermining the prospects of the 2-state solution. And Deputy Executive Director Hannah Suleiman informed us of the wide-ranging humanitarian consequences of what was happening in the West Bank, especially for children, and again rightly called for protection. The Council must respond because the situation in the occupied West Bank is deteriorating rapidly. What we are witnessing is a clear pattern of coordinated illegal measures designed to entrench the occupation, alter the demographic and territorial realities on ground, and undermine the prospects of a Palestinian state. Settlement expansion has reached an alarming scale. The expansion of settlements in the E1 area, the launch of the Crimson Thread project, and the settlement activities in the heart of West Bank are all part of a broader effort to fragment the Palestinian territory. This is accompanied by unprecedented settler violence. The West Bank has experienced its largest displacement crisis since 1967. Furthermore, expanded unlawful Israeli authority over land registration, administration, and enforcement is compounding de facto annexation in violation of UN Security Council resolutions and the ICJ advisory opinions. Alongside these measures, the continued withholding of Palestinian revenues is severely undermining Palestinian institutions. These revenues belong to the Palestinian people and must be released immediately and in full. We are equally alarmed by escalating provocations at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Al-Haram Al-Sharif. On 24th July, The group of 8 Arab Islamic countries in their statement have condemned the continued mass incursions by settlers. The cumulative effect of these mutually destructive policies and actions is intimidation, dispossession, and forced displacement, thereby perpetuating the cycle of occupation and annexation, all in flagrant violation of international law. Madam President, in Gaza, the humanitarian situation is extremely fragile. President Trump's comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict provided an important opportunity to alleviate humanitarian suffering and advance a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. This opportunity must not be allowed to be squandered. Pakistan has welcomed the positive developments under the Board of Peace towards the implementation of the Gaza Peace Plan and Resolution 2803. We appreciate the mediators, including the US, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, for their sustained efforts. However, Israel's continuing military escalations and recent rejection of the roadmap risk undermining this diplomatic process and jeopardizing the prospects for peace. In view of the concerning developments, the international community and this Council in particular must act without delay. First, the Council must ensure that Israel, the occupying power, immediately halt all settlement activity and reverse all unlawful measures aimed at altering the status, character, and demographic composition of the occupied Palestinian territory in line with relevant Security Council resolutions, including 2334. Second, settler violence needs to end immediately, and those responsible must be held accountable. Third, the Palestinian people must be provided international protection, as also requested by the Palestinian president in his letter to the Council. And the Council must respond to the 4 recommendations concerning protection that were made by the UNICEF representative today. Fourth, Israel must respect the historical and legal status quo at the holy sites, including Al-Aqsa Mosque, Al-Haram al-Sharif, and halt all provocative actions. Fifth, the Security Council Resolution 2803 and the comprehensive peace plan must be implemented fully and in good faith. The Council must have a serious discussion how to tackle the obstacles and violations. Madam President, as the foreign ministers of the group of 8 Arab and Islamic countries, including Pakistan, affirmed on 6th August in their statement, the ongoing Israeli violations in the Gaza Strip cannot be viewed in isolation from the attacks carried out by settlers in the occupied West Bank, the unlawful expansion of settlements, and the unilateral measures aimed at altering the status quo in occupied Jerusalem. Taken together, these practices constitute a systematic policy aimed at imposing a fait accompli by force, undermining the foundations of the two-state solution. Madam President, the situation is approaching a dangerous tipping point. Unless this trajectory is reversed, the consequences for the two-state solution and for peace and stability across the region could be catastrophic. The path to peace is clear. It lies in ending the Israeli occupation and enabling the Palestinian people to exercise their inalienable right to self-determination through the establishment of an independent, sovereign, viable, and contiguous state of Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. It is the only credible foundation for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, Russia supported the convening of today's Security Council meeting with a goal with a focus on situation in the West Bank. We believe it's unacceptable to further erode international attention toward the task of achieving a just and lasting Middle East settlement, the cornerstone of which was and remains the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The confrontation, which decades later remains the key irritant in the region, perpetuating its general state of crisis and causing new flashpoints of tension to emerge in the broader Middle East region. We thank the Deputy Special Coordinator of the UN for the Middle East peace process, Ramiz Alakbarov, and the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Hanan Suleiman, for their detailed briefings on the situation in the West Bank. We agree with the alarming assessments of these UN representatives. Essentially, the West Bank is approaching a point of no return with a risk of profound destabilization of the military-political situation in the entire region. The reasons for this dangerous trend are well known. They lie in the creeping expansion of Israel and the OPT, the escalation of settlement activity, of settlement violence, and the unprecedented tightening of Israeli restrictions on the movement of Palestinian residents. Against the position of most of the international community, West Jerusalem continues its illegal policy of building new settlements. A few days ago, the government issued yet another tender for the construction of over 600 housing units in the province of Ramallah and Al-Bira. Settler violence has reached extreme levels when it's carried out not only with impunity, but sometimes with the connivance of Israeli soldiers. In late July, early August, there was a wave of attacks carried out in a number of cities in which radicals burned mosques, ravaged homes and vehicles, and dozens of people were injured. According to openly available sources, this settler violence is reaching tragic new levels. Since the beginning of this year, over 11,000 attacks have been committed. Israeli civilians have killed over 20 West Bank civilians. In parallel, we're seeing intensifying IDF operations to clear West Bank towns and refugee camps. These armed raids are accompanied by arbitrary arrests of Palestinians and large-scale restrictions on their movement. Especially troubling is the fact that due to these measures, the largest Palestinian towns are blockaded, and even emergency medical services have been suspended. We call on Israel to refrain from any arbitrary measures, including settlement activity, that undermine the prospects for a two-state solution, as well as to take effective measures to curb settler violence and to immediately return to implementing relevant UNSC and GA resolutions. Madam President, of equal concern is the volatile situation in another part of the OPT, that is Gaza. The practical implementation of the American peace plan for Gaza has essentially stalled. Certainly, it's important to note that thanks to the efforts of mediators, large-scale bloodshed has ceased in the enclave. However, the ceasefire regime continues to be systematically violated, mainly by Israel. This is clearly demonstrated by the numbers of victims. In less than a year since the formal entry into effect of the ceasefire, Israelis have killed almost 1,300 Palestinians. Among them, according to UNICEF figures, there are almost 300 children. That means that over the past 300 days in Gaza, on average, one child has been killed per day by Israeli soldiers. Despite this tragic reality, here at the Security Council, a number of Western delegations have over the past few months placed the entire responsibility for the stagnation of the Gaza peace plan on Hamas alone. We all recall how during Security Council meetings, the leadership of Hamas were insistently called upon to immediately lay down their arms, not to hinder the work of the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, and to accept the roadmap of the High Representative of the Board of Peace, Nikolai Mladenov. We'd like to hope that our Western colleagues will show the same unity and resolve with regard to the other party to the conflict in light of the public rejection of the roadmap by West Jerusalem, while Hamas has agreed to the deal. Madam President repeatedly noted that success of any peace initiative on Middle East settlement will be measured by the achievement of its chief goal, the creation of a single, independent, and contiguous state of Palestine and the West Bank and Gaza, with its capital in East Jerusalem. The creation of a state coexisting in peace and security with Israel. As demonstrated by the experience of the past few years, it's impossible to resolve the Palestinian issue, as well as the entire spectrum of Middle East settlement issues, hastily or through the promotion of ad hoc backroom schemes. Equally futile are attempts of certain countries to monopolize the role of mediator, especially when the principal mediator acts solely in the interests of one side of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Under these circumstances, one can hardly expect to see justice or the fulfillment of the aspirations of the Palestinian people. However, an alternative path remains open. Achieving lasting stability and an improved situation in the Middle East is possible and necessary through coordinated international and regional efforts that rely on the extensive international legal basis for settlement, the cornerstone of which is the two states for two peoples formula. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señora
Thank
Presidente.
you, Madam President.
Panamá agradece la convocatoria
is
de esta
grateful for the
reunión
convening
y
of this
expresa su
meeting.
reconocimiento
We
al señor Ramiz Alakbarov,
thank Mr. Ramiz
subcoordinador
Alakbarov,
especial para el proceso de paz en
Deputy
Oriente
Special
Medio,
Coordinator for the Middle East
y a
Peace
la
Process,
señora Hanan
and
Suleiman,
Ms. Hanan
directora
Suleiman,
ejecutiva
Deputy
adjunta de
Executive
UNICEF,
Director of UNICEF,
por sus valiosas
for
y
their
conmovedoras
invaluable and
exposiciones.
moving testimony.
Asimismo,
Moreover,
reconocemos a los
we
representantes del
recognize
Estado
the
de Israel
presence of the
y del Estado
representatives of the
Observador
State
de
of Israel and the
Palestina
Observer
que
State
nos
of
acompañan
Palestine.
en esta reunión.
They are with us in the chamber this morning.
Observamos con profunda
We
preocupación
note with grave
el
concern
creciente deterioro de la
the
situación en
increasing
Cisjordania,
worsening of the
que han
situation in the
descrito
West Bank
con cifras
that
los
has been
expositores,
described by the briefers
donde la
with
reciente
figures.
escalada de
The
violencia
recent
e
escalation of
intimidación
violence and
sigue
intimidation
cobrando vidas,
continues to
provocando
claim
el
lives,
desplazamiento de comunidades
trigger the
y
displacement
agravando
of communities,
la situación
and
humanitaria.
worsen the
A
humanitarian
ello se
situation.
suman las restricciones
In
de
addition, we're
movimiento
seeing restrictions
siguen
placed on
limitando el
movement that
acceso de la
continue to
población civil
stymie
a
access to
servicios
the civilian
esenciales,
population and their access to
incluida
crucial
la
services,
atención médica de
including
emergencia,
emergency
así
medical
como a sus
care
medios de vida,
and
agravando
livelihoods.
las condiciones que
That, in
enfrentan
turn,
las comunidades
worsens
más
the
vulnerables.
conditions endured by the
Tal
most
como lo ha
vulnerable
explicado
communities.
Con dramática claridad, la señora
With
Suleiman,
dramatic
en su
lucidity,
exposición,
Ms. Hannah
entre
Suleiman
quienes
described
sufren
just
de
that in her
manera más
briefing. She
aguda
said that those
las
that most acutely
consecuencias
suffer
de
the
esta situación
consequences of this
se encuentran los
situation
niños.
include
La
children.
persistencia de la violencia,
The continuation of
incremento de los
violence, the
ataques y
rising
los
tide of
desplazamientos
attacks and
forzados
forced
no solo
displacement
afectan a Cisjordania,
do not only
objeto
affect the
de
West
esta sesión,
Bank, that is the subject
sino
of
que
this
también
meeting.
comprometen el
These
bienestar,
phenomena
el
also
desarrollo
undermine
y
the
el acceso
development,
de
well-being,
miles de
and
niños
access
a una educación
of
segura
many
y continua.
children to safe,
Por ello,
uninterrupted education.
reiteramos la importancia
As
de
such, we
garantizar
reiterate the
un
importance
acceso
of guaranteeing
continuo,
safe,
sin temores
continued
ni intimidación
access without
y
fear
sin
or intimidation.
interrupciones a
And
la
indeed, this
educación.
access to
La
education
protección de
must
la
also
niñez
be
y el
uninterrupted,
acceso a la
protecting
educación,
children and
así
access to
como la
education,
disponibilidad de
as
atención
well as
médica
ensuring the
adecuada,
availability of
son
adequate medical
elementos
treatment,
esenciales
are
para
all
preservar la
crucial
resiliencia
components
de las
of preserving
comunidades y
community
sentar
resilience
las bases de
and
una
of
paz
laying the
duradera.
basis
Las
for
escuelas
a
deben
lasting peace.
permanecer como
Schools
espacios
must
seguros de
remain
aprendizaje
safe
y
spaces for
protección,
learning and
libres de
protection.
temor,
They must
de
be free of
intimidación
fear,
y de los efectos del
intimidation,
conflicto.
and spared the effects of the
Toda
conflict.
afectación a la infraestructura
Any
educativa o
impact on
interrupción del
educational
acceso
infrastructure
a la
or any
educación
disruption to
compromete
educational
las
access
perspectivas de futuro
undermines
de los niños.
children's prospects for their future. President, violence does not only claim lives and destroy livelihoods, it also fuels a climate of ongoing, relentless fear that limits freedom of movement, that exposes victims of attacks to displacement risks, and this violence also undermines their physical and mental health because daily activities such as leaving houses become a constant source of concern and insecurity. Consequently, protecting civilians must continue to remain an immediate priority. This must be done with stringent adherence to international law, including international humanitarian law and the relevant resolutions of this Council. Against this backdrop, Panama reiterates its support for the work that the United Nations and its agencies continue to do. We particularly commend the laudable work of UNICEF done alongside international humanitarian organizations and local ones to afford assistance to civilians. We commend their work to protect children, to support efforts aimed at preserving stability too. This work must be able to continue safely in an independent and impartial fashion, while international law is stringently upheld, including international humanitarian law. We call for humanitarian personnel to be protected, and full, safe, unfettered, continued humanitarian access for those who require it must be provided. The continuation of violence, the lack of political progress, continued attacks and measures which fan the flames of tension continue to undermine the conditions necessary for the preservation of a credible peace. Any unilateral action which alters the reality on the ground is incompatible with the spirit and goals of this Council's relevant resolutions, including Resolution 2334 of 2016. The implementation thereof remains vital if we are to preserve the foundations for a just, lasting and mutually acceptable peace. As such, it is vital that we see the resumption of a credible political process. We must bolster confidence and trust, champion a reformed Palestinian Authority able to discharge effectively its responsibilities, and we must avoid unilateral acts which continue to further dim the prospects for a negotiated solution in accordance with international law and the relevant resolutions of the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. First of all, China extends its deepest condolences to the victims of a massive earthquake in Colombia and expresses its sincere sympathies to the bereaved family and the injured. We're confident that under the leadership of their government, the Colombian people will surely join forces to overcome this disaster as soon as possible and rebuild their homes. China supports the convening of this emergency meeting of the Security Council, which is both timely and necessary. I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Alak Barov and Deputy Executive Director Suleiman for their briefings. China is deeply concerned about the recent escalation in the occupied Palestinian territory and is deeply distressed by increasing civilian casualties caused by the ongoing violence. Against the backdrop of increasing instability in the region, we must not allow the Palestinian issue be ignored or marginalized. The international community should take swift action to do everything possible to curb conflict and violence, save innocent lives, and uphold fairness and justice. I would like to make 3 points. First, we must set the record straight, address the root causes, and truly respect the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people. For some time now, the situation in the West Bank and Gaza has seen a sharp deterioration, leading to more pain and suffering to the Palestinian people. At its core, this is due to the fact that the fundamental principles of the international law have not been respected, while the Palestinian people's rights to survival and development long ignored. The lives of Palestinian peoples are just as precious as those of any other people. The international community must uphold a clear sense of right and wrong, further build consensus, promptly correct all erroneous words and deeds that deny or infringe upon the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, and ensure their equal rights, so as to effectively uphold international fairness and justice. Second, decisive and effective action must be taken to stop conflict and violence. The situation in the West Bank has been escalating dangerously. The occupying power is pushing forward with its settlement expansions, desecrating and vandalizing religious sites, blockading refugee camps, and carrying out mass arrests, while settler violence is intensifying. It is shocking that the training center of UNRWA has been forcibly stormed on 2 occasions. The protection of civilians is not an empty catchword, but an obligation under international law that the occupying power must fulfill. Israel must implement Security Council Resolution 2334, cease settlement activities, curb settler violence, and ensure strict accountability. The agency's normal functioning in accordance with its mandate must be respected. The situation in Gaza is equally concerning. Even after the announcement by the Board of Peace of progress on the second phase of the ceasefire, Israel has continued to refuse to halt its operations. It has now been more than 300 days since the signing of the ceasefire agreement, yet a lasting ceasefire has yet to be achieved. The current situation is not due to a lack of ceasefire proposal, but a lack of a political will to implement one. China calls on Israel and all relevant parties to implement fully and in good faith the Gaza ceasefire agreement, and urges Israel to comply with international humanitarian law by lifting restrictions on the entry of humanitarian supplies. Countries that have significant influence over the parties should take concrete actions to de-escalate the situation. Third, we must stay the course and make every effort to revitalize the political prospect of the two-state solution. The two-state solution is the only viable path to resolving the Palestinian issue as recognized by the international community. Any hesitation, skepticism, or wavering is unacceptable. Both Gaza and the West Bank are integral parts of the state of Palestine. Israel must end its illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories as soon as possible and cease undermining the governance structures of the Palestinian National Authority. The international community should fully respect the will of the Palestinian people, advance post-war reconstruction in Gaza in accordance with the principle of Palestinians governing Palestine, return to the correct path of the two-state solution, and realize the early establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Only in this way can peaceful coexistence between Palestine and Israel be achieved, and lasting peace and stability in the Middle East be secured. Madam President, on the question of Palestine, China has always been on the side of peace, justice, and conscience. China will, as always, support the just cause of the Palestinian people to realize their legitimate national rights, work to bring an early end to the suffering of the Palestinian people, and make unremitting efforts to restore stability to the region and bring peace to its people. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
President, we commend the convening of this timely meeting at such a sensitive time. We thank the briefers, Mr. Ramiz Alakbarov, Deputy Special Coordinator, and Madam Sulaiman, Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, for their briefings. We stress the following. The Kingdom of Bahrain has supported international and regional efforts to end the conflict in the Gaza Strip, including the comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict and the role undertaken by the Board of Peace to support practical measures to strengthen stability, reconstruction, improve the living conditions, and pave the way for a credible and serious peace process. The Kingdom stresses that the success of any peace process requires that we address the escalation in the West Bank, which undermines confidence and weakens the opportunity to implement the two-state solution. This has been thrown into sharp relief by the expansion of settlements, the seizure of land, the demolition of homes and schools, including restrictions on cities and camps, as well as rising violence by settlers and the attempts to impose a unilateral reality. This has stoked the suffering of civilians, including that of children, and undermined efforts for calm and peace. We are concerned by the escalation of violence against the Palestinian people in the West Bank. This rise has been unprecedented. 76 Palestinian civilians have been killed since early 2026, according to the United Nations. We stress the need to protect civilians, including children, from the consequences of this highly dangerous escalation. We warn against the consequences of unilateral policies, practices, and measures that are aimed to impose a unilateral reality. They run counter to international law, including IHL, as well as relevant Security Council resolutions, in addition to the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. They run counter to the international consensus on the rejection of the annexation of Palestinian territory. Violations against Muslim and Christian holy sites are aimed at altering the identity of Jerusalem, and they cause tension as they outrage the conscience of millions of Muslims and Christians throughout the world. The Kingdom of Bahrain stresses the importance of spreading coexistence and mutual understanding to counter extremist behaviors and ideologies. We stress the need to respect the historic and legal status quo of holy sites. We stress the need to end violations perpetrated, including excavations under and around Al-Aqsa Mosque. We underline that the Holy Aqsa Mosque and Al-Quds al-Sharif in their entirety constitute a holy site for Muslims. The management of Al-Aqsa Mosque is therefore subject to the historic Hashemite custodianship over Muslim and Christian holy sites in Al-Quds al-Sharif. In this regard, we commend the meeting held in Amman on the 5th of August. In conclusion, the Kingdom of Bahrain stresses that East Jerusalem is an integral part of Palestine, which encompasses the West Bank and Gaza. It is the capital of the State of Palestine that must be established along the 4th of June 1967 borders, a state that lives side by side in peace and security with Israel, to pave the way for the two-state solution and ensure regional integration to foster stability, security, and prosperity for all peoples of the region. I thank you.
Representative of Bahrain for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Madam President, allow me to begin by thanking Deputy Special Coordinator Al-Akbarov and UNICEF Deputy Executive Director Suleiman for their updates and for the UN's continued work in the occupied Palestinian territory. Somalia remains deeply troubled by the recent surge in violence across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The past weeks have seen more civilian deaths, injuries, displacement, and destruction, worsening an already dire humanitarian and security situation. We unequivocally condemn the growing violence and terrorism from Israeli settlers against Palestinian communities, often in a context where Palestinians are left unprotected. These attacks on civilians are not isolated incidents. They are happening in a wider context of long-standing occupation, illegal settlement expansion, demolitions, evictions, military operations, movement restrictions, land seizures, and ongoing settler violence. Together, these factors are eroding the foundation of Palestinian life in the West Bank. Since January 2025, over 33,000 Palestinians have been forcibly displaced by Israeli military operations in Jenin, Tulkarm, and Nur Shams camps, which is the largest displacement since 1967.
many more lives remain at imminent risk. Settler violence is a major driver of this crisis, with more than 1,800 attacks in 2025 alone, affecting some 280 Palestinian communities. This pattern must be reversed. Somalia reiterates that Israeli settlements, including those in East Jerusalem, are a flagrant violation of international law and Security Council Resolution 2334. A worrying development has also been seen in the increasing use of archaeology and heritage claims to justify settlement expansions and restrict Palestinian access to land and holy sites. All actions that alter the status or demographics of the occupied Palestinian territory must stop and reversed immediately. We are particularly alarmed by measures that fragment the Palestinian territory, threatening its viability as a contiguous sovereign state. Continued settlement expansion undermines not just future negotiations, but the very basis of the two-state solution. Madam President, as we have heard, the situation for children demands urgent attention. Palestinian children are facing violence, displacement, detention, abuse, and disruption of their education. Prolonged insecurity is inflicting severe psychological distress. School closures, movement restrictions, and attacks on education have become alarmingly common. The ongoing financial crisis and the disruptions to UNRWA schools make matters worse. Children must not grow up seeing violence, occupation, and displacement as a normal daily occurrence. Their protection and that of schools, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure must be guaranteed under international law. The impact, dear colleagues, goes beyond children. Restriction on movement and access are affecting healthcare, livelihoods, water, and sanitation, and are making it harder for humanitarian organizations to provide assistance. Humanitarian workers themselves face growing danger and obstacles. We are especially concerned by the recent incursions into UNRWA premises in East Jerusalem, including repeated unauthorized entries by Israeli security forces. Such incidents cannot be normalized. UN premises must be respected and protected, and UNRWA's vital work must not be jeopardized. Somalia is also concerned about the deteriorating situation facing the Palestinian Authority, especially with the occupying powers withholding of hundreds of millions of collected tax revenues, which undermine the provision of basic services. Weakening Palestinian institutions while settlement expansion accelerates moves us further from peace. Accountability is essential. Violence by settlers must not go unpunished. Restraint and de-escalation must be prioritized. Yet restraint alone will not solve the root causes, which are entrenched in occupation, settlement expansion, and the lack of credible political horizon. The West Bank and Gaza are one territory and must be governed by a single legitimate Palestinian Authority. A political process that ignores this will not bring lasting peace. Somalia stands firmly for the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to an independent and sovereign state of Palestine based on the 1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. The Council must ensure that just and lasting solution remains achievable. We call on Israel as the occupying power for an immediate end to settlement activity and violence, full respect for international law, unhindered humanitarian access, protection of civilians, especially children, and real accountability for violations, including ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity. Madam President, above all, unless the international community and this Council turns commitment to this two-state solution into meaningful action, we are maintaining the status quo of Israeli occupation, perpetual violence and suffering for the Palestinians, including children and the people of the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to our briefers this morning. As the United States has said many times, we strongly condemn violence by any party in the West Bank. The United States appreciates the Israeli government's condemnation of and the increased actions to counter violence in the West Bank. Israel has taken specific steps, such as increasing law enforcement actions, to boosting the IDF presence, and to allocating significant financial resources to counter violence. The United States will continue to work constructively to increase security, reduce tensions, and enhance stability that is beneficial for both Israelis and Palestinians alike. President Trump's 20-point plan to end the Gaza conflict makes clear that the PA must verifiably complete a slate of reforms. The United States will not accept compensation for terrorism under the guise of welfare or through any other attempts to evade detection under a different name. The United States reiterates its opposition to annexation of the West Bank. The Security Council must continue to show our strong support to the Port of Peace and the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. They are working to advance President Trump's peace plan, which this Council endorsed in its historic Resolution 2803 last November. We also welcome the progress that the Board and the NCAG have achieved so far. This includes boosting humanitarian assistance with safeguards in place to minimize Hamas's stealing and looting of resources. We further welcome the milestone achieved at the end of July, when Hamas finally, and for the first time, committed to an actionable plan for its disarmament. All parties must build on this momentum to full and irreversible disarmament and ensure that Gaza is never again a launching pad for threats to Israel's national security. This path forward, as the Board of Peace has noted, holds the promise of delivering significant benefits to the people of Gaza. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Denmark. And I would like to start by thanking Deputy Special Coordinator Alak Barov and Deputy Executive Director Suleiman for their briefings. What we've heard today is not just statistics, as DED Suleiman stressed this morning. It is the daily reality of Palestinian children living under the threat of settler violence, loss of livelihood, demolition, and displacement. These realities were also reiterated in the Independent International Commission of Inquiry's report examining violations and crimes against Palestinian children that was published in June. At the same time, we hear that July was an exceptionally deadly month in the context of settler-related violence. This is why Denmark, together with France, Greece, Latvia, and the UK, supported by other Council members, called for this urgent meeting. Colleagues, the two-state solution, as chartered in the resolutions of this Council, remains the only viable path to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Last September, 142 states reaffirmed their support for this vision in the New York Declaration. But for this vision to materialize, the current trajectory in the West Bank must urgently be reversed. We would like to emphasize 4 urgent matters. First, settler violence must stop and those responsible must be held accountable. No Palestinian child should witness homes set ablaze, access to schools hampered, destroyed livelihoods, or blocked water sources. We urge the Israeli authorities to take immediate measures to prevent violence, protect civilians, and ensure accountability. The European Union has recently put more extremist Israeli settlers and organizations responsible for serious and systematic human rights abuses against Palestinians under sanctions. Second, the expansion of illegal settlements must end immediately. We remain deeply concerned by the potential issuing of tenders for the E1 settlement, which threatens to separate East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank and divide the West Bank in two. We urge businesses to be aware of the potential legal, financial, and reputational risks associated with bidding for these contracts. We once again stress that Security Council Resolution 2334 must be fully implemented. Third, Palestinian children deserve to grow up under a functioning, effective, and reformed Palestinian Authority able to pay salaries and provide essential services. We therefore reiterate our call for Israel to release withheld tax revenues and for the PA to continue its important work on necessary reforms, including on democracy and good governance. Finally, the developments in the West Bank cannot be separated from what happens in Gaza. The stability of both Gaza and the West Bank is critical to any lasting peace, including to Israel's long-term security. It is in the interest for both Palestinians and Israelis to transition Gaza from war to peace. We took note of the recent news of progress towards an agreement on the disarmament of Hamas and urge all parties to reach a full agreement on this decisive issue. And we continue to call on all parties to fully respect the ceasefire, on Hamas to disarm, and on Israel to ensure the phased withdrawal of the IDF in line with Resolution 2803, as well as to ensure unhindered humanitarian aid. A lasting ceasefire will lay the groundwork for early recovery and reconstruction. In this regard, we welcome that the EU has launched the Team Gaza initiative, which Denmark is a part of. This initiative will contribute to the much-needed early recovery efforts in Gaza, including crucial areas of water infrastructure, removal of rubble, and waste. Colleagues, developments in the West Bank threaten the vision of a two-state solution that we, as international community, have elaborated in so many resolutions and declarations over the past decades. The longer we wait, the less realistic that vision becomes. This Council must stay loyal to its decisions and ensure the implementation of a two-state solution, reuniting Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, under a reformed Palestinian leadership along the 1967 borders, two states where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace and security. And I now resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, allow me at the outset to express our appreciation to you for convening this urgent briefing upon the request of Denmark, Greece, France, Latvia, United Kingdom, supported by Bahrain, China, Russia, and Pakistan, to address the critical situation and ongoing escalation by Israeli occupation forces and settlers in the West Bank. Allow me also to thank the two briefers, Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Ramiz Al-Akbarov, and Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Ms. Hanan Suleiman, for their comprehensive reports. And let me also add, I listened very closely to the very clear, principled, powerful statements from all of you with regard to the violations committed by the Israeli occupying forces and the settlers against the Palestinian people, especially children, and we appreciate this very strong sentiment. And as many of you have indicated, what is needed is action. You are the Security Council. You have responsibilities to act and to enforce international law and your will and resolutions, and not a single party to continue disrespecting all of us, not listening to any one of us, to be held accountable and to be brought to the position that the Charter of the United Nations expect as an obligation from each member of this esteemed organization, the United Nations. We cannot continue to meet, to condemn, to explain, to give details, and yet business as usual. Somebody takes note, ignores all of us, does not respect its obligation as a member of this organization, and we do not act. We can act, we should act. We are formed as a Security Council to make sure that the international peace and security of the world is maintained, and if any one party, a state, does not meet its obligation in this regard, to be held accountable, and you have tools available to you to act. Madam President, Israel's objective remains the same: seizing maximum Palestinian land with minimum Palestinians. All its policies can be traced back to this singular objective pursued through military assault, settlers' violence, home demolitions, discriminatory laws, and annexation measures. The tools and the excuses may vary, but the pattern is always the same: uprooting Palestinians from their land or denying them the right to build on it, to grab it. To the Palestinian state recognized by nearly 160 states. We exist as a state. Look, I sit behind the plaque that says State of Palestine. We have 160 countries that recognize the State of Palestine, including the great majority of the members of this Security Council. The reality is that one state is illegally occupying the land of the other state. So therefore, we need the international community, the Security Council, to help the State of Palestine that lives under ruthless occupation, illegal occupation, using the words of the International Court of Justice, to help us to end this illegal occupation, as the International Court of Justice said, as rapidly as possible. Of course, we appreciate all efforts to make this occupation less vicious, if there is such thing as that, in the process and in the way and the path of ending this illegal occupation. That is the main objective: ending this illegal occupation, not to make it a nicer occupation. And many of you have exercised that during the time of putting an end to colonial occupation and control in the past. So I don't need to explain to you what you were struggling for in order to attain your freedom and liberation. We are the last kid around the block. We need to end this evil system imposed on us, oppressing us, stealing our resources, killing our children, doing all the evil things that the UN reports describe, all of the agencies of the United Nations describe, and other NGOs, organizations describe as well. So it needs to end. And all people who respect and honor international law and their obligations as members of the United Nations, and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the UN is to help us to put an end to this tragedy. We, the Palestinian people, are doing our role. We are staying in our land. We lost thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands killed and injured during the last 3 years alone. And we are doing our job in order to attain freedom and independence of our state. We need the help of those who believe in the same principles that we are committed to. And we appreciate the fact that some of you took some measures. But there is more that needs to be done, because this ruthless occupation, illegal occupation, is refusing to abide by everything that you describe, by all the reports that describe, by the articulation of the International Court of Justice. Then what should we do? Just keep urging them, keep appealing them, or resort to measures and use tools available to us? Some of you are doing it in their national capacity. We appreciate that. But there is more that needs to be done so that this illegal occupation cannot feel that will make all of us come to the conclusion that we are wrong and this illegal occupation is right. The Palestinian people are telling you by paying heavy price, we will never surrender. We fight for our legitimate rights, including our right to self-determination, the independence of our state, and the right of the refugees. We are doing that, and we are not reinventing the wheel. All of you who faced similar situation, you struggled for your rights. But also all of you received support from the international community, and we expect support from you. It has, to the Palestinian state recognized by nearly 160 states around the world, Israel opposes the settler state, armed and unhinged, with its full support and complicity. It has created an enabling environment for violence by its soldiers and its settlers, guaranteed to them effective impunity, unleashed them against Palestinian communities, refugee camps, and villages to torment and terrorize the Palestinian population. Many of you gave details about these things. For years now, we have called for international protection. Many of you referred to that need. International protection in accordance with the resolutions of this very council, for deterrence, for real accountability, for practical measures to counter these policies on the ground, not only condemn them in international fora. And while countries are taking measures, as I said, they are no match to the Israeli grave breaches, nor are they dissuasive in nature. Only when it is too late will the world again realize that the cost of inaction far exceeds the burden of resolute action. In the West Bank, this attack against the Palestinian people includes an attack against the Palestinian Authority, whose role is essential in preserving Palestinian presence in the land. Through the theft of our financial resources, which many of you refer to the attack against our institutions, which many of you refer to, Israel is seeking the collapse of the PA in the hope that this would precipitate the transfer of Palestinians outside of Palestine, displacement. Madam President, throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, annexation is underway. It's not an idea. It's underway, brutally and relentlessly. Palestinians have now been confined to 30% of the Gaza Strip, 40% of the West Bank, and 13% of East Jerusalem. This is by design, through decade policies aimed at emptying the land of its people, displacing and replacing them. These last few years saw a dramatic acceleration of these policies that have yet to be met with an appropriate response able to put an end to them. There is some action. We need more and more and more until this illegal occupation to yield to the international law and the position of the Security Council and its resolutions. In Gaza, Israel's response to the agreement reached over disarmament and full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza was not to welcome it, but to reject it and to continue its bombardments against the Palestinian population. The Comprehensive Peace Plan and the New York Declaration rely on key principles: no occupation, no annexation, and no displacement. This is what the two plans have in common. This Israeli government is fully committed to pursuing all three at all costs and by any means. We all say no annexation, no occupation, no displacement. They are not only saying, they're working day and night by all means, yes to annexation, yes to occupation, and yes to displacement. The plan builds towards reunification of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as many of you have indicated, under the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian self-determination and independent statehood. The Israeli government is fully committed at preventing them at all costs and by any means, and they don't hide it. They announce it every day. While Palestine and the Arab and Muslim countries are doing their utmost, and a number of these examples and statements that were released recently were referred to, are doing their utmost to ensure the implementation of the plan, Israel keeps undermining it, whether for electoral purposes or territorial objectives. This constant undermining of international efforts has to stop. Lives are at stake, and they cannot be subject to electoral calculations or radical ideologies. The future of the region is at stake, and it cannot be left to be decided by colonial appetite or hegemonic aspirations. We have a common vision and a common plan, and cannot allow any spoiler to derail them. They must be implemented. All of us are saying we want to implement the 20-point plan of President Trump, reflected in resolution of the Security Council 2803 and the New York Declaration. All of it, the plan, the 20 points, not a la carte menu. You select from it what you like and you discard the rest. No, from point 1 to point 20 and the New York Declaration. The international will cannot bow before the colonial whims of the Israeli government. Madam President, elections are to take place in Israel and Palestine in the coming weeks. The world should send an unequivocal signal that it has charted a path for Palestinian freedom, self-determination, and independent statehood that leads to two states, Palestine and Israel, living side by side in peace and security, and to a region of sovereign states that together can foster a future of shared peace, security, and prosperity. The other path leads to a very different outcome, one this region has visited time and time again, one of occupation, wars, loss, and bloodshed. How much more bloodshed from our children and our women and the vulnerable and all the Palestinians we need to put at the altar for this illegal, vicious occupation to leave us alone and to allow the international community to prevail and succeed in supporting the Palestinian people in their quest for freedom, dignity, and independence. Show our people that there is a peaceful path that leads to freedom, dignity, and security. I appeal to you, the Security Council, show our people that there is a peaceful path that leads to freedom, dignity, and security. And demonstrate to the Israeli people that this path of colonizing Palestinian land and controlling and destroying Palestinian lives is not the path that leads to security, peace, and acceptance. It is time for our region to unleash its true potential, one that can only be achieved through a free Palestine, respect for the rights and safety of all peoples, and the sovereignty of all states. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I would like to convey our thoughts and prayers to the people of Colombia following the devastating earthquake. Madam President, as we gather to discuss the escalation in Judea and Samaria, let me set the record straight. Israel condemns all violence against Israelis and Palestinians. Israel does not tolerate extremism. We confront it, but we do not ignore the reality on the ground. While Israeli extremist attacks are declining, Palestinian terrorist attacks are rising, making up the majority of attacks in Judea and Samaria. This May, there were 348 Palestinian terrorist attacks only in Judea and Samaria, 8 pipe bomb attacks, 282 stone-throwing incidents, 32 firebomb attacks, 24 arson incidents, and 2 serious car ramming attacks. That is up from 325 attacks in the month of April. According to the Israeli security forces, another 408 terrorist attacks were stopped before they could happen. How many of you have condemned these terrorist attacks against the Jews? None of these attacks were mentioned by the briefers, and none of these attacks were mentioned by many of you. This is the bias we are confronting today. This council is focusing on one side of the violence while ignoring the other. Madam President, Israel is combating extremist violence in all its forms. When it comes to Israeli extremism, we are expanding our presence on the ground in Judea and Samaria. Israel's comprehensive framework has led to increased enforcement against Jewish extremism. Those efforts have been successful. Through the first quarter of 2026, we opened 354 investigations, filed 20 indictments, and arrested 35 extremists. This has led to a decrease in extremist violence. There were 116 total incidents of Israeli extremist violence in June, down from 165 in March. Enforcement is ongoing. Last week, an Israeli was indicted for alleged killing of a Palestinian near Hebron. He will face the Israeli justice system. We condemn this violence. We prosecute these crimes. We hold perpetrators accountable. Our Prime Minister, Defense Minister, military leaders have all made clear addressing extremist violence is a priority for our government. At the same time, Israel is intensifying its efforts to prevent Palestinian terrorism. Our security forces are working every day to dismantle terror networks and prevent attacks before they reach Israeli civilians. We are finding a growing threat. Iranian weapons, funding, and training are flowing into Judea and Samaria, alongside efforts by Hamas to establish new terrorist infrastructure. Madam President, the Palestinian Authority is supposed to help us to mitigate this problem, to fight terrorism, but instead they continue to fall short of that responsibility. Even after a presidential decree for Mahmoud Abbas, the US State Department informed Congress that the PA continued pay for slay. Through 2025, they distributed about $200 million to terrorists and their families. We still see incitement to violence promoted in their communities. This doesn't stabilize the region, it fuels the violence. Madam President, this terrorism does not just threaten communities in Judea and Samaria. You know the proximity. It's being exported throughout the state of Israel. The danger is present, the violence is endless, and the victims are real. A few months ago, a Palestinian terrorist infiltrated Israel from the village of Kabatia. It's a village near Jenin in the northern Samaria. He drove from Kabatia to Bet Sha'an, an Israeli city 25 miles away. He rammed his car into Shimshon Mordechai, who was killed standing on the side of the road. Then he hit and injured a 16-year-old boy in a nearby town. The terrorist kept driving to the entrance of a kibbutz and Harod, where he rammed into Aviv Maor. She was waiting for her parents to pick her up from the bus stop. After he rammed into her, he stabbed her until she died. Aviv was only 18. She loved nature and animals. She was passionate about horseback riding and photography. That was not it. He continued driving. He kept going. He found one more victim at the entrance to the city of Afula. When the terrorist couldn't run the man down in his car, he smashed his head with a rock. A 50-minute rampage of terror until he was neutralized. Let me ask this council, why wasn't there a special session after that incident? What about the shootings at bus stops in Jerusalem and other events? Madam President, this reality reflects a double standard that we must address today. When speaker after speaker refers to settler violence, it is an insult to thousands of years of continuous Jewish history in the land of Israel. Jews have never been and will never be settlers in Judea and Samaria. The vast majority of residents in Judea and Samaria are law-abiding citizens. Those committing violence are a tiny fraction of the people living there. They do not represent the broader community. That is why when you actually use the term settler violence, it's a provocation. Why? Because first, it denies our connection to the land of Israel. It distracts from constant terrorist attacks against Israelis, and it collectively labels entire innocent communities for the crimes of the marginal extremist minority. When Israelis are involved, some of you uses a collective label. You call it settler violence. See how many times you used it today. But when Palestinian radicals carry out attacks, you refer only to the ones responsible. And that is the standard for all extremist violence around the world. You know, look at your countries. Take a look at the UK. A few months ago, a radical Islamist stabbed 2 Jews in Golders Green, the Jewish neighborhood in the heart of London. Did you use the attack to label nearly 4 million British Muslims as a threat? Did you describe it as evidence of Muslim violence throughout Britain? Of course not, because you understand the difference between extremist and an entire population. That is not justice, that is prejudice. Yet that is exactly the standard being applied to the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria today. 500,000 Jews. So when you say settler violence, what do you mean? That 500,000 Jews are terrorists? Support terrorism? Madam President, while Palestinian terrorists seek to drive Israelis from their homes, some voices in this council speak as though Jews have no right to live in Judea and Samaria. That is not true. We are not occupier, we are not settler. Our right to live in our land is based on our historical connection to it. It is described in the Torah, the Old Testament, and even the Quran mentioned the connection of Jews to the land. This past week, Jews around the world read this verse from the Torah. I will read it first in Hebrew. כי אתם עוברים את הירדן לבוא לרשת את הארץ אשר אדוני אלוהיכם נותן לכם וירשתם אותה וישבתם בה. And in English, you are crossing the Jordan River to inherit the land which God is giving you. You will inherit it and dwell in it. Judea and Samaria is where our story in the land of Israel began. It is where it will continue. There has been a continuous Jewish presence in this land for thousands of years. The name Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethel, they are not names invented by modern leaders or modern politicians. They are part of the DNA of the Jewish people. And this history was recognized by the international community. The League of Nations mandate for Palestine affirmed the historical connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. It called for the founding of a Jewish national home there. The international legal framework established after World War I confirmed that historical connection. That framework included Judea and Samaria. Our history is not a political slogan. It is part of our historical and international record. Madam President, I could lecture for hours about our biblical rights, our historical rights, our legal rights to Judea and Samaria. But if we want to be practical today, and if this council is serious about bringing security and stability to the region, it must understand a simple truth. We are not going anywhere. Jewish communities will stay in Judea and Samaria, just like the Palestinian communities. Over 500,000 Jews live in 4 large cities and over 200 communities in Judea and Samaria, alongside over 2 million Palestinians. The Jewish communities are not temporary outposts. They are not obstacles to peace. They are permanent neighborhoods, cities, home, families. Today, this council has a choice. It can either repeat rhetoric that fuels the conflict, or it can support real efforts to find a way to live in peace, in stability, and security. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now World.